Welcome to Thread. I'm Joel Nagel, and I'm the program director for the Disciple Center of Education, and I'm building interactive and immersive resources for churches and their members to coincide with the Thread podcast. And I'm here with Dr. David Pocta, who's the executive director of the Disciple Center for Education. He has a PhD in spirituality from Oblate School of Theology, and he's the host, along with Hannah DeSouza of the Thread podcast. Welcome, Dave. So good to have you.
So great to be here. Excited to talk about Thread.
Yeah, I've got a few questions for you. The first question is, can you just tell us about the Thread podcast? What's the purpose of the podcast? Who's it for?
Yeah, so Thread was it's been a multi-year kind of imagination of what kind of podcast did we think we could build in this era that would really meet needs for where people are at spiritually. And I just came off this 6-year, study journey, focusing on spirituality and really looking at how we experience our Christianity. And so, I think the idea of taking Thread into this podcast narrative was to trace out what the Bible says from beginning to end. What's the meta narrative? What's the big picture? And how does that really play into our spirituality? So that's really what the genesis of the whole idea was.
That's great. And who would you say the podcast is aimed toward?
Yeah, we've kind of come up with this, I don't know if this is new, but it's new to us, this idea of the informed Christian. This is not a podcast meant to lay foundational groundwork for someone just entering the faith. It's really deeper dive into really looking at the text and all the things that it means for us and how we live out our faith. Although I certainly would say it's a great place to start if you're on your journey to learn. But it really is geared toward the informed Christian. It's a little deeper. There's a little more scholarly, work there, but it's also extremely, I think, accessible and applicable.
Yeah, and I think anybody who knows you would absolutely think that's who this podcast was for, but also that it could be accessible. I think you do a great job with that. Speaking of knowing you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your co-host, Hannah?
Well, for me, my wife and I served in the full-time ministry in the International Churches of Christ for 26 years. And that took us from Minneapolis to Chicago to South Africa to San Antonio. We really had an amazing almost 3 decades of ministry work. And then I felt this need to go back and study. Part of it was to answer some of my own questions about what does spirituality look like in the second half of life. I just felt like I didn't know enough. I wanted to learn more. And so it ended up turning into a 6-year PhD program. I felt very fortunate to study with some of the people in the academic environment that study spirituality. It was a really great blessing to study under some of the internationally known best figures in this kind of space. So that's been amazing. So I finished my PhD November 2022 and came on to work with the Disciple Center for Education here. I also hold an academic post at Oblate. I'm the director of the Spirituality Institute there, which is a real honor, and it's a joy to be able to now work with those folks over at Oblate. So Hannah is one of our students. So part of our vision with the DCE was to help fund others to pursue top-level education. And Hannah DeSouza grew up in a ministry family in London. She ended up going to Oxford to get her master's degree in Victorian literature, as one does. And then we brought her on as one of our scholars. She's currently at Harvard working on a master's degree in theology, and then she'll go on and do a PhD. So it's just been a lot of fun working with her. It's what I love about this is, I'm the older guy. She's under 30. She's from a different country. She has a great accent. It's just been a lot of fun. We really enjoyed the recordings we've had so far.
That's great, and I can attest to that, having listened to getting a sneak preview of the recordings, and it's been amazing to listen to what you guys are putting together. So let's talk a little bit more about what Thread is. So Thread explores the Bible through the lenses of story and spirituality. Episodes 2 and 3, spoiler alert, are devoted to those topics. Can you give listeners a brief description to help us know why those lenses of story and spirituality are so important?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think a lot of times Christians get really caught in the details in Scripture and miss the big picture. And so we approach this primarily from this angle of story because we're all about the meta-narrative. What's the big picture? What's God trying to communicate? And it's about love, right? It's about God as our creator, creating us in love, for love, and all that happens in our life is in love and for love. So story's really important from that sense. I also think story plays a unique role in how we think about the Bible, that it's not a list of moral, commands, even though some of that's in there, but the whole big picture really is, it's about a story about God and his people. So we are going to look at story through the lens of the Trinity over the next 3 years. So we want to look at Yahweh, the Old Testament deity, God, as he calls himself, Yahweh, and the people. We're going to look at Jesus and the people, and we're going to look at the Spirit and the church. And I think that's a really needed discussion around that. So that's the reason for story. Spirituality, of course, is what I've just been immersed in over the last 6 years in my own work. Spirituality speaks to our experience, and it addresses the whole way we orient ourselves in the world. So when we talk about spirituality as it pertains to the story, as we hear God's love for us, how do we orient our life, engage the world in a way that reflects that love? And that's really why spirituality is important. So spirituality ties in a lot of important other things, like what we think and what we believe, how we practice, our spiritual disciplines. All those things are encompassed in that. So it really gives us a real broad base to really address those things.
Wonderful. And I've listened to a lot of podcasts about the Bible and Christianity, and I don't think I've ever heard anything so ambitious and from those lenses. Very, very exciting. Do you have tips for listening to the podcast or watching on YouTube each week? We're really hoping that people will build this into their lives as a habit for their spiritual life. Maybe even any tips for people who aren't really podcast people. How can we make this part of our lives?
Yeah. So, it's interesting talking to friends about podcast people and non-podcast people. And, there are certainly folks that listen to a lot of podcasts and others that it's just not their world. What's interesting about what we're doing with Thread, we are offering it in audio and video. Audio because of accessibility. I think that's the kind of way a lot of people are used to listening to podcasts. They jump in their car, they put on a podcast, or they go for a walk. I think when you ask about tips, what's interesting about what we're doing is we're teaching. It's not just a conversation, it's teaching too.
Yeah.
And so the reason we felt really strongly that it had a video component is we're creating slides, diagrams, we're showing scriptures. So I would say where possible, this would be best on YouTube, where you can sit down with a notebook, open it up, take notes, and really take in what we're teaching. The idea is that we drop one a week and that people will then have a week to process and continue to work on the concepts that they learned. And so each of these is pretty full of stuff, right? I had a friend in Chicago. He was an elder when we were in the ministry there. He goes, "Dave, I just want stuff. Give me more stuff, like content. Yeah. And I would say that that's really what this is about. This is a full plate. We want people to have a full meal. And so, for me, if you ask for tips, I'm going to say sit down, have a pen and paper, be in a place where you can really learn. And if that's what doesn't work for you, then, make the best of it. But that's what I'd suggest.
I love that. Yeah, I think the old adage, you get what you put into it. But in this case, you get so much because it really is a full meal. Every episode is really substantial in terms of what you can learn and take from it. It's been so good. So along with the podcast and listening or watching the podcast, we're also creating this host of resources. That's my role with the podcast for churches and their members, so they can really immerse themselves in each week's topic, and that it can be integrated through all the levels of the church, from the adults to the kids, leaders, members. What gets you excited about those resources, Dave, and that supplement that's coming with the podcast?
Yeah, it's funny how much this has already come up in conversations with church leaders. When I think about a church leader, and the average church is, 100, 150 people, that's really where most churches sit. But someone who serves in the ministry in those situations has a lot to do. They're wearing all the hats.
Yeah.
And to have the time as a church leader to do the research every week, to do the preparation for a great Sunday sermon, for additional content, for family devotionals, for quiet times, all of it, right? How do we immerse people in this is nearly impossible. And yet we have the ability to kind of come alongside and build that to support small churches particularly. And I think it's going to have a lot of other implications. I think a lot about, house church environments or friends that just want to have something to sit down and talk about. So when I think about all this other surrounding content, it's basically a smorgasbord, right? There's a buffet. You can really have access to anything you need from small group conversations and beyond. And so I really think that this is super unique to give people access to this kind of content that follows a 3-year plan.
Yeah.
I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, wonderful. I think one of the keywords we've talked about a lot is integration. And we've talked about that on a couple of levels, that leaders who use that content will need to integrate it into their lives, not just regurgitate. Keep using food metaphors here. This interview is making me hungry. And then also we want to integrate, parents and the kids learning the same things on Sundays, and small groups having the same things to talk about through small group devotionals, through daily quiet times. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of integration?
Yeah, it's interesting. Even this week, I shared the first episode with a friend, and she loved it, and she turned around and her first response was, how do we help our kids learn this as we learn this? And, as a parent, someone who raised 2 now adult girls, what you do at home and how you bring them into your own spiritual experience is really challenging. So to have that assistance where you've got family devotional ideas that go along with what you're already thinking about in your own spiritual life,
yeah,
at a level that your kids can process with you is so critical. It brings the faith journey into this more holistic way of engaging your spiritual life. So I think it's fantastic, but it goes, it follows the circles. It's your immediate family circle. It's your small group.
Yeah.
It's your midweek. It's your Sunday. And so, as I think we all know, you don't really learn or change something in your life in a once-off sermon. It
Right.
takes repetition and being immersed. So I think that's what's happening here. I think we're building something we can be immersed in every aspect of our spiritual life for 3 years. And the hope is that we really can help people to be transformed and renewed and to find hope and excitement in their relationship with God.
Yeah, it's a beautiful vision, and it's been so neat to sit in my seat and to see it be just a vision only a few months ago, and now really becoming something. It's been incredible. So last question, are there any other thoughts you have, tips for success as people and churches and leaders begin the Starting Point series and jump into this 3-year journey that we're calling Thread?
I think maybe my last comments would be there's no rush. Take your time. I mean, part of the nature of having this kind of content created is you don't have to do it in 3 years.
Yep.
And we're creating it in a way that it will be able to be handled in segments. So if someone wants to jump into the series with us for 6 to 8 weeks, they can follow a segment of the series and then they can do some other things and then they can come back to it. And so I think even the fact that the podcast, once it's dropped, it's always there.
Yep.
So some churches may start in September 23 and some may start in March of 24, and that's okay. Right. So it's really about the journey, and it's about the long-term, work that we're doing in our spiritual life to grow. So I think I would just say we don't have to quickly get everything aligned and make it all work right away, but lean in and take your time and let it really transform you.
That's great. Thanks so much, Dave. Thanks for joining me in this interview. If you haven't found Thread yet, you can find us at threadpodcast.org. And the Thread Podcast app anywhere where you can buy apps, and you can find the podcast anywhere where you can listen to podcasts. And of course, you can watch it on YouTube as well. Dave, thanks so much for joining us. And thank you everyone for joining us in this journey of Thread.